I am so humbled and so honored, and also jumping out of my skin to bring you the one and only, this awe-inspiring supernova soul and friend, Dr. Zach Bush, MD. Dr. Bush is one of the most brilliant minds of our time. He is on a totally different level, or should I say solar system, than any other medical doctor you'll meet, and you're going to learn why very shortly. His mission is to provide understanding between environmental health and our emotional, spiritual, and physical health. His approach is to combine science, humanity, and the intelligence of nature to transform the world. Dr. Bush is the founder of Seraphic Group, which develops root cause solutions for human health relating to our gut microbiome, our soil, glyphosate toxicity, and the gut-brain connection. He is a highly respected authority in the health and wellness space and travels all around the world speaking. And he's just pure brilliance and a gift to us today and the generations to come. So get ready, because when it comes to emotional eating, he is going to blow the roof off this thing. So Dr. Bush, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Welcome to What We Crave. I'm so grateful to have you on the summit.
Awesome. I'm just so pleased, Errin, that you've put this together. It's such a critical topic, and I think really has the opportunity to inform so much beyond just our eating behaviors and all that, and really look deeper into who we are as a community and a species. And can't wait for the discussion. It's beautiful. So thank you for the ingenuity and brilliance in bringing that topic to the front.
It's an honor to sit with you, because you're going to bring to light some serious light to an epidemic of mass disconnection. And so there's a few things I want to shine a spotlight on, which is how our gut microbiome, our gut and our brains are directly connected, the healing power of human connection and touch, and why and how we get addicted to our story. So, but let's rewind, talk a little bit about how you got here, because I mean, your path as a medical doctor has been anything but conventional.
Yeah, I think nonlinear is maybe one description of my journey, and it's probably everybody's. I think, fortunately, we can't write our own story because they would be so boring. And so it's a series of, apparent failures and mistakes and all that, to then realize in hindsight it was your perfect path, and that would be my career for sure, I feel like, at this point. And so I started very much outside of the medical system. I was a mechanic and passionate builder of things. So I started a little car restoration company when I was like 15 with one of my buddies, and then eventually got myself realizing I needed to make more money. So got into construction and landscaping and sprinkler work and all that, paid my way through college with that. And then coming out of the college experience, I realized, that I needed to branch out into the health sciences through an experience that I had in the Philippines, birthing babies with an international group of midwives. And that just completely changed and rearranged my entire concept of life, watching these tiny premature babies being born in these horrific, environments of starvation and poverty, really just, was such a shock to my system that I couldn't really reorient to my previous trajectory towards engineering and robotics or whatever I wanted to do. And so that was the first major shakeup, and it happened through heartbreak, which I kind of love how dramatic a 19-year-old kid can be. Like, I had one girlfriend, she cheated on me and broke up with me, and like, oh my gosh, like I just thought the world was coming to an end. I was only as dramatic as a 19-year-old can be. And for that reason, I decided I needed to take a year off to recover from my stupid heartbreak. And lo and behold, that is exactly what shaped my entire world after that. And so I'm just so grateful for the drama king that I was at the time. To think that I needed that time was actually a deep wisdom kind of starting to emerge, that I now look back and be like, oh, my soul knew exactly what was going on there, and it induced an event to make me totally stop the whole story that I had been living up until that point, and allowed this concept of medical care and health to come into my worldview. I had nobody in my family had ever been a medical doctor, and I was just not on my radar screen. And so it's been really an exciting journey in the last 25 years since then to like kind of experience the transitions that continue to happen. And one of the big ones was after 17 years in academic training towards that medical career and everything else, I had a couple subspecialties in internal medicine and endocrinology, which is the study of kind of advanced disease and disease management in internal medicine, and then endocrinology, the study of hormones, regulation of body metabolism, how we store and burn fuel, how we balance the stress effect in the body, these kinds of things. And so that was my world kind of clinically, and then I had gotten into cancer research around the endocrine topic of hormone regulation and endocrine tumors of the endocrine glands. And so I'd gotten my world into the kind of chemotherapy development around those topics. And once again, a huge catastrophic, heartbreaking event happened. And this time, my love with scientific, medicine and allopathic medicine was what had to break my heart. And the heartbreak was over the course of my research in chemotherapy, I'd realized there hadn't been a single case of cancer in human history that was caused by a lack of chemotherapy. So no matter how I got good at doing that, I would never find a root cause solution for these patients that were every year suffering at a higher and higher prevalence in our country of cancer. And so fortunately, my research had been around vitamin A compounds and how they could kill cancer. And so that was my entry point into nutrition, with the possibility that food could fight and prevent or treat cancer. And so it turned out there had been 40 years of data to say yes, yes, yes. I just hadn't been taught that in my worldview. And so I had to see the next heartbreak, which was I tried to start a nutrition center to reverse chronic disease at the University of Virginia, where I'd been at for almost a decade. And it was heartbreaking to see, mentors and, all the people that had been part of my life there have to completely turn their back on me, and leave me in the dust when, funding shifted with the recession. But it was really more that my career was shifting from drug design into, education and all that. It just was really non-viable, especially with bringing a nutrition message that didn't align with the nutritionists and dietitians that were teaching diabetes education and the like in the hospital systems, which was very much food pyramid BS. And so it was so sad for me to leave that environment. I really had become president of my student body at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center, then chief resident at UVA. I thought I was like being groomed, and everybody was telling me I was being groomed to be some chief of medicine somewhere and really change and dictate medicine. And so to see that world turn its back on me in like a split second and kind of reject a new paradigm was heartbreaking, because I thought that was the whole purpose of academia, was to allow freedom for professors to push the envelope on knowledge. And it turns out that's not how funding works in academia. And academia is actually not as progressive as you would hope it to be, and it takes often 20 years for a new idea to become, start to have some traction in the academic environment. So all of that was heartbreaking. I thought I was losing my identity professionally when I decided I had to leave academia and start this rural clinic nutrition center in impoverished area of Virginia. And for the first time since the Philippines, I was then dealing with kind of fourth or fifth generation poverty again. And this time in a food desert in the middle of America, and seeing starvation of a different type happen, this time not of calories, but starvation of nutrients, and seeing that fuel chronic disease. And so in my passion for bringing solutions of nutrient, I was very much go big or go home kind of guy. And so I was making my patients like juice 2 pounds of kale a day and just going crazy. And a third of my patients was like magic, like diabetes disappear, heart disease reversed, all this magical stuff that had been proven in the literature for 40 years would happen, happened. And that was exciting, and I felt like the best physician that I'd ever felt. But at the same time, there was a third of my patients that weren't really improving much, and were stuck on meds, and I wasn't, they were getting frustrated, I was getting frustrated. And there was a third that were really misbehaving, and that their inflammation markers were going up, not down. And it took 2 years of me watching that patient population doing the wrong thing on the lab tests for me to come to trust that they were actually doing what I asked. I had just assumed, well, that third must not be doing what I'm telling them to do, and they're sneaking Twinkies and Wonder Bread and all that. And it turns out, those became some of my closest friends, ultimately, those patients of mine, because they really developed a trust relationship with me, and they really poured their heart out saying, I am working so hard, and yet I can't lose weight. I can't do this and that. I can't, get my diabetes under control. And so I had to go back to the drawing board of what nutrition was. And that began at the plants themselves, starting to ask tough questions of like, why is the kale making this patient bloat and increase inflammation? Is there something missing in the kale, or is there, this thing? And so the first thing we found was obviously that all the nutrients were missing. Kale from the 1970s is much different than kale of today. Tomato, another example. lycopene, this rich anti-cancer compound in tomatoes, suddenly disappears from the modern tomato. So we've got this real nutrient deficiency going on within even our health foods that we think of in a plant-based kind of diet that I love to teach. And so that was kind of the beginning, but then we had to ask deeper questions as to the soil and what had happened to the soil to allow the plants to lose those nutrients. And that was, another heartbreak moment when we found out that not only had medicine led us down the wrong track, modern farming and agriculture had run us down the wrong path. And in both cases, it turns out the same chemical companies were at the end of those false stories that we were living. Mm-hmm. And those chemical companies have devised the herbicide, pesticide, and fossil fuel style nutrients that we deliver to our plants that have so narrowed our dietary experience, and they have shaped the pharmaceutical industry simultaneously. And ironically, many of the things that we pulled out of the plants by growing them under the influence of herbicides and pesticides, by deleting out those medicines, we now sell those back to patients on the other side of the equation, selling back those medicines as if there's some pharmaceutical breakthrough, when in fact, those are the nutrients that used to be there. And that's been known since, Hippocrates and 4,000 years of Chinese medicine, that food should be our medicine. And so that was true up until about 1996, and suddenly we engineered the nutrients and the medicine right out of our food. And so that's kind of the long journey that's brought me to this, current state of my career, which is really trying to meet farmers and physicians at the same point, which happens to be the microbiome, because it turns out that soil looks a hell of a lot like a healthy gut, and vice versa. And so that's been my journey to this kind of synchronistic moment of singularity, if you will, of realizing that the entire collapse of ecology, global warming, rising oceans, human disease, explosion of autism, Alzheimer's, dementia, diabetes, depression, acne, all the way to cancer, all of that is from one single root cause, and that roots us back into this microbiome story.
For those of us that are new in this microbiome space, tell us more about the gut, how it's sort of the center of the universe for health, the gut-brain connection, all that.
Fantastic. Yeah. So the microbiome is starting to be a catchphrase that you see all over the place in the lay literature and in advertising and all that. I recently just saw that Dawn has now a microbiome-friendly soap, which is impossible. That's not how soap works. And so, but they've so seen the spat of the microbiome that they've decided to put that on a bottle of shampoo. And so I'm amazed, friendly to the microbiome. That's their catchphrase. Right. And so it's like, just so interesting to see how pseudoscience can develop into a belief system, and gut health is, I think, among the most misunderstood, and the probiotic industry has capitalized on our misunderstanding of what the microbiome is. The probiotic industry, now $42 billion a year industry, is built on completely fake science, and is really, a lot of science now recently proving that it is causing as much harm than as potential lack of efficacy. So it's really sobering to see how we can twist, scientific words to make it sound fancy, when in fact we're carrying a message that's completely false. Soap that's friendly to the microbiome, or probiotics that are good for gut health. Pretty much the same statement. So the gut health has been poorly defined by physicians, let alone consumers. And so quickly, to define gut health, there's two major components. Number one is biodiversity of the microbiome, which means beyond bacteria. Certainly there should be 20 to 30,000 species of bacteria in your gut, in your skin, in every organ system. We now know there's microbiome in your liver, in your kidneys, in your, breast, in your, in the brain itself, beyond the blood-brain barrier. So we have microbiome literally in and within and all over us. And that 30,000 species of bacteria is dwarfed by the 300,000 species of parasites that we live in and around in our environment. And that's dwarfed again by the 5 million species of fungi that we live in and around and within. And that's again dwarfed by the viruses that are 10 to the 31. That's one with 31 zeros after it. You just started writing that out on a piece of paper to get a comprehension of how many viruses we are surrounded by on a daily basis. That 10 to the 31 viruses is indicative of the fact that it's impossible to live without relationship with the microbiome. It is so ubiquitous in our nature. Furthermore, that microbiome we now know is the vast workforce for the body. the human system, of detox, metabolism, all the things we think of about human immune system, blah, 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 only accounts for 10% of the overall work done in the human body. More than 90% is done by the bacteria alone. And we haven't even started to be able to really calculate how much work is being done by the enzymatic processes of fungi and viruses and beyond. So I think we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that we may only be 1%, representing the enzymatic workforce as we talk about human genome and human gene output. And so we are the minority within our own body by a severe amount. So that's the microbiome and its diversity and our potential to connect. That's half of the equation. The other half is the gut integrity. And so the intestinal lining should be a barrier against the outside world. Many of us, when we start to think about food cravings and emotional eating, realize that it's damage to our self-identity that will lead to these behaviors most typically. And it's fascinating to realize that the most common herbicide that we use today, which is glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup and almost every other weed killer on the market now since it came off patent. But that glyphosate molecule disrupts the Velcro that creates that healthy barrier between the outside world. And once that tight junction Velcro is damaged, you become a leaky sieve. And your immune system that sits right behind that single cell barrier suddenly is inundated with the outside world. Bacteria, fungi, all that starts to interact inappropriately. But deeper than that, even the nutrients within the kale can suddenly become noxious. And so this was the breakthrough that helped me understand how is kale making people bloat and get irritable bowel syndrome and inflammation markers go up. Kale has extraordinary amount of alkaloids in them. And alkaloids are the medicine within our food. But like any pharmaceutical drug too, the medicines within our food, if unregulated and dumped into the immune system, can actually cause inflammation. So unregulated absorption of alkaloids, but even then more basic, unregulated absorption of the fiber in the kale. Soluble fiber should always come into the body. Insoluble fibers should really stay outside the body typically. They play a huge role in anti-cancer effects in colon and prostate and the like, but they shouldn't be hitting the immune system. And if you have a leaky gut, opens up the opportunity for some of these large molecules that should never get into the immune system to react. And so through the dumping of the outside world and the inappropriate entry of even organic compounds into your immune system, your nutrition can become your problem. And that's why we see 1 in 3 children now with nutrition sensitivities and allergies and all of this. We have over 18 million adults in the United States diagnosed with gluten sensitivity, but that number is probably only looking at 10% of those with actual diagnosed gluten sensitivity, or actual clinical gluten sensitivity. Worldwide, we might be at 300 million people now with gluten sensitivity. So we have this epidemic that rose when we disrupted self-identity at the cellular level with the introduction of the Roundup Ready crops in 1996. That's when we saw the explosion of gluten sensitivity and celiac disease and food sensitivities all around, nut allergies. If you do a food sensitivity panel, I'll bet you 80% you're going to see at least 4 of your favorite foods on that list, because your favorite foods that you consume on a frequent basis entering a leaky gut is going to force your body to react to that avocado or whatever it is.
So really, when people think, oh, I have food sensitivities, it's actually, no, it's just a glyphosate toxicity. And that's at the core of so many issues. What does someone with a massive leaky gut, what are some of those symptoms that they're experiencing compared to someone that's healthy? When I think it's clear to say almost everyone has a leaky gut issue if they've ever had anything to eat ever, because we can't escape it, right? It's everywhere. It's in our air, it's in our food, it's in the water.
You're spot on. And unfortunately, glyphosate is a water-soluble toxin, which is not what nature intends. Nature tries to do fat-soluble toxins so that they can be sequestered out of things like the bloodstream and your extracellular matrix and your cytoplasm of your cells and all that. And so a water-soluble toxin that can get into every part of the water ecology does exactly as you say. We spray it on crops and soil, and yet it immediately enters that water table. And so some of that will run off into streams and then ultimately into oceans. And another set of it will run down into our fossil aquifers that are now highly contaminated. But then another portion of it, of course, will evaporate, and that ends up in the air with glyphosate detectable at 75% of our air in the U.S. in many recent studies, and then 75% of our rainfall contaminated as it ends up in the clouds. And so that's the whole water cycle at the ecologic level. And then at the physiologic level, we recently completed a clinical trial looking at our supplements that help reduce that toxicity of Roundup. And in that study, we couldn't find a single subject that didn't have detectable Roundup in their urine. And so the water that enters it through your food or through your drink will then enter the water cycle within your body, affecting the liver, the bloodstream, which then affects the immediate blood-brain barrier, breaking down that holy of holies kind of barrier between your brain and the peripheral nervous system and whatever's in your bloodstream, and then breaking down, importantly, the kidney tubules that are responsible for detoxing your body and holding on to hydration and the like. And so you get dehydrated, increased toxicity, and you're a leaky sieve on the front end. And so we become sponges for toxin and inflammation as we lose that intelligence of that gut membrane. And so that's the phenomenon. Now, what are the symptoms of that, as you ask? That's going to get into the common ones that you would think of with any kind of chronic fatigue, irritable bowel / gluten sensitivity or whatever it is. It's going to primarily be neurologic first, right? So yeah, you might get some bloating, but when we look at the actual symptom display of the syndromes, they actually always start at the brain. It's brain fog, poor sleep quality, fractured sleep being specific in that, poor sex drive, low serotonin dopamine levels resulting in mild depression, anxiety, and then moving into even like full-blown generalized anxiety disorders, and then moving down into the bowel, bloating, poor digestive quality, cycles of diarrhea and constipation, bloating after meals, and again, brain fog exacerbating with every single meal that you have and the like. So those are kind of the predominant experience of that leaky gut syndrome. The downstream, as that inflammation continues to happen, is chronic inflammation, then chronic disease. And so as you switch from this acute inflammation that you have to mount every time you get exposed to the chemical or food, then comes this chronic inflammatory state that around the clock, no matter if you're eating or fasting or whatever, your immune system has become your problem. And that leads to things like autoimmune diseases, the cascade of more severe neurologic stuff being severe major depression, anxiety disorders that are entrenched, psychosis, all the way down. Now, where does eating disorder fit into this? It's pretty obvious at almost every single level, right? So as you lose self-identity, and that erodes at the cellular level, interestingly, there's an immediate impact on serotonin and dopamine production at your gut lining, which produces over 90% of your serotonin in your body and over 50% of the dopamine. So here we are giving everybody antidepressants that are supposed to be blocking the serotonin behavior up here, when in fact the gut is why they're out of serotonin. And so that depressive kind of quality that sneaks in, that then just asks for some sort of drug-like experience to stimulate the reward pathway with that lack of serotonin and dopamine, we're looking for the food more and more. We look to sex initially, but then the pattern is typically sex drive goes down further and further as depression increases, as sleep disorders increase, and so we replace that kind of sex drug effect with food drug effect, and then we end up in this very base state of isolation, where now all that matters is sheltering ourselves away from external stressors long enough to get to the next meal, to get another surge of dopamine so that we can have a little bit of reprieve from the depression. And that cycle continues. And then, of course, we have self-loathing about that behavior and all that. All of that needs to be taken away when we realize if we take the microbiota, the bacterial and kind of whole microbiome kingdom that we talked about, from an obese human subject, and we put it into a mouse who's in a controlled setting, no external stressors, normal daily routines, normal calorie intake, within a month that mouse is obese. So what that tells us is that the microbiome, in its damage, starts to make us behave a certain way. And it's not that it's forcing a behavior, it's that in its shrinkage of microbiome diversity, in its lack of capacity to protect that self-identity at that gut intelligence, gut membrane level, we have collapse of the serotonin dopamine system, and we have collapse of the kind of coping mechanisms around inflammation, and all that snowballs. And so by taking the limited and damaged ecosystem of an obese gut and putting that into a mouse, we immediately have the cascade of behaviors that will ultimately lead to obesity. And so I think it's fascinating that there is no character flaw involved. It's simply a loss of biodiversity. And so I want every one of you listening right now to write yourself a massive permission slip, just saying, it is not my freaking fault. This is not me that is having these symptoms. It is actually a deep disconnect from a diverse microbiome, a diverse reality of ecology within me and connected to without me. That disconnect is leading to this isolation event, leading to this breakdown, leading to these pathologic behaviors and pathologic, storage of fat and everything else. Those cycles are not you. It's the nature and the perturbation and dysfunction of the nature within you that's driving those results. And so I want you to just give yourself a blank slate, a new canvas to paint your new story on, which is, oh, I'm simply a human being, which is a form of biology that has become profoundly deficient in my soil and root system that is my gut, and I can no longer absorb what I need. And so I'm going to start this journey anew, understanding that my soil is the whole mission for everything else, my self-identity at the cellular level, my neurologic reserve and dopamine serotonin reservoir at my gut brain axis, into my behavior when I'm not stressed with chronic inflammation, into my physical capacity when my muscles recover quickly from exercise and I want more exercise instead of feeling stiff and like I'm 80 years old the day after exercise and
Right.
then I'm on the couch for a couple of days. Like, that cycle is so easy to break if we stop thinking it's a personal problem and start seeing it as a soil problem. And that's how we can move ourselves, I think, out of the whole self-abuse trap that our brain will set.
I just think there's so many people that are just don't feel like themselves. They're like, I'm a positive person, but I don't feel like myself. Like something is off. And our guts are telling us something is off and we know it, but we can't put our finger on it. Glyphosate is not talked about in most cases anywhere in the public eye unless it's on something like this. And there's like thousands of lawsuits against Monsanto right now, right?
There's over 19,000 now, yeah.
How many?
19,000 and counting. So
Yeah. How long has been glyphosate been in our world for, would you say?
yeah, so a relatively short amount of time, right? So 1974 is when they bought the patent, and it really didn't really hit the market until 76. But then it was really just used as a spot weed killer. It killed just about everything it touched, so it took some time for them to come up with different formulations so that it can be used in different applications. But it really didn't hit the mainstream until 1996, when Monsanto gained the capacity to genetically modify corn, soybean, and alfalfa, and ultimately many other, over 30 different crops now, to be able to handle the effect of glyphosate. And so then we could spray our food directly with the chemical. And that was, I think, when all hell broke loose in the whole cascade that we just described.
Right.
That glyphosate molecule has been patented as an antimicrobial. And so antibacterial, antiparasite, antifungal, it kills the microbiome. And so as we start to pour more and more of that in the soils from 1996 to today, we see the destruction of the microbiome on a vast level. Currently, we're spraying around 4 billion pounds of this chemical into our soils worldwide every year. So it's just a devastating reality.
The work that you're doing is, well, let's fast forward to that, because you found a solution to combat glyphosate, and it's clear that the discovery was not by accident. So tell us about that and where you're at now.
Yeah, that last statement was the most important there. I definitely didn't find it. It found me. Me and my colleagues in 2012 at the Nutrition Center were trying to figure out why the food wasn't working. One of my colleagues brought in a white paper on soil science, and on page 40 of that thing is a large molecule that looked a lot like the chemotherapy I used to develop, with its capacity to bind oxygen and hydrogen. And so it was an aha moment that perhaps all of these years of 4,000 years of modern medicine looking to the plants for our source, we maybe missed a deeper story, was that the soil itself could tell a story of health and healing and disease management. So that really was a massive shift for me in 2012. We set out to start to understand that molecule, and it was about a year and a half or so into that journey that my chief scientific officer, who's John Gilday, a PhD, brilliant from Johns Hopkins geneticist, he was the one to put the whole thing together and realized that we had found, we were seeing incredible results once we got those molecules stabilized. And he was the one that figured out that it was functioning as an antidote to that Roundup injury, which is that tight junction Velcro injury to the whole gut lining, the blood-brain barrier, the kidney tubules, and all that. And so it was a total paradigm shift that really all happened by accident. I think that's the story of science as a whole, is nobody really sets out to create a paradigm shift. You're simply going down a line of of thought, and then something comes out of the blue and totally disrupts the story that you've been telling yourself. And then you have to either choose to ignore that piece of data, which I think happens all the time, or come to terms with the fact that maybe you were wrong about the story you've been telling yourself, and look to the right and see what's there. And when we looked to the right on this one, it was pretty amazing that we suddenly had a smoking gun for not why cancer was happening, but why all disease epidemics were happening on the planet since 1996. And so, and in parallel with that, why did global warming suddenly kick off, and why did all of this ecologic disaster suddenly kick in a short 30-year period? And all the answers pointed back to a single chemical. All the answers pointed back to a single physiologic disruption that has a lot to do with self-identity. And so it's all a fascinating journey, but that's how we accidentally found the compounds. We developed from that now a line of human supplements, started with the gut health one, and then very quickly we launched the sinus product, realizing that the sinuses are the beginning of the gut. So when you're doing all this work to try to get your gut working, and you have chronic sinus drainage, especially in the mornings when you wake up and cough up a little mucus and you're always a little congested, you can't ignore that. That's the beginning of a dysfunctional gut, because all of that snot dripping down the back of your throat is seeding your entire upper GI tract with abnormal flora that shouldn't be there. Sinus bacterial flora should look much different than gut flora. And so when you're starting to get that transfer of all that junk down into your gut chronically, you're at risk of small bowel overgrowth with the wrong bacteria. And that can lead to all kinds of symptoms similar to what we've described previously. And so the sinus product was a realization of, like, if we can help support normal physiology through the sinuses and the nasal passages, we will change that upper GI tract, which will further impact the efficacy of the gut product that's been working to put the lining of the gut back together and stop micromanaging the microbiome with probiotics and allow the microbiome to actually expand in diversity by functioning as a communication network between the species. And so that's how the journey took place. And how that happens is these little carbon molecules made by bacteria and fungi end up in soil systems. And so we ended up going back in the fossil record 60 million years to find the deepest layers of soil that have existed on the planet, which existed at that time right before a catastrophic event that led to the fifth great extinction on the planet, when the topsoils died. The topsoil died on the planet when an asteroid hit, covered the whole planet in a layer of dust, choked out the top level of soil, and we suddenly lost 85 to 95% of life on Earth, including the dinosaurs famously. But at that moment of loss, we lost soil integrity, and since then we really have never, we've been moving towards a better soil ecology over the subsequent 55 million years. But the records would suggest that was our optimal biology on the planet was some 60 million years ago. So we go to that band within the desert, and it's only a couple inches down from the top in the desert, and you're at 60 million year old fossil soil. And from that, we start extracting that communication network from a vast ecosystem, each species making their own version of these carbon snowflakes. And so when we get that into a liquid state, change hydrogen oxygen binding, we can get like a liquid circuit board effect to happen where suddenly electricity passes very easily through tissue. And ultimately, we are electric beings. We are light beings in a particle state, which means we're moving energy from cell to cell to make anything work. And so all that energy pulsing through our system is coordinated now through a liquid circuit board, if you will, to coordinate cellular response to the environment. And so we think that we may have devised the very first supplement that does nothing. And we really try not to have any signal that suggests that the supplement itself is trying to do anything to human physiology. Instead, we're making sure it's functioning as that cell-cell communication, just similar to the cell phone tower that's never made a phone call to your grandma.
Right.
The cell phone tower is there to help your phone communicate with grandma, but it's passive and agnostic as to what message is sent. That's what this supplement does. So we've got this communication network from the microbiome that sets up that cellular response system, cellular communication, so one cell can hear what's happening outside, hear what's happening inside, and know what proteins to make, what enzymes to make, how to detox. And that's exactly what we get to see. When you put this on a small intestine membrane or a colon membrane, it immediately starts making more tight junctions within seconds. And so its whole instinct is to create self-identity. But if it's missing that microbiome communication, it doesn't know how to do that well. And so it's a really fascinating thing that human self-identity is inspired and, in fact, supported and perhaps wholly dependent on the communication network of a microbiome. So I'm humbled by that and always fascinated by our vulnerability when we think of ourselves as an isolated species.
And that's probably one of the most powerful points, I think, of this whole conversation is you just said that the molecule that's in this fossil, or this, the nutrients and the molecules, the communication network that's in the soil, you basically stumbled upon it in this massive time of an epidemic, in this glyphosate epidemic that happened to be buried in the soil. Which, by the way, the first time I heard you give this speech, I actually cried. I was like, are you kidding me? This is like amazing. You find this, beautiful thing in the soil that you can now put into liquid to give to our guts, and it basically, let me break this down easily, is it restores the communication within our gut, this sort of netting of communication, and lights it all up so that it can talk to the rest of the body. And what it does is not only zips up the leaks, which are where the tight junctions have been damaged, right? The tight junctions are like little zippers, right, in the gut. So those glyphosate is what destroys those, and this actually repairs it, zips it back up, creates essentially an inner armor for the gut, restores a communication network, which restores the immune function, detox everything else, restores the identity of the cell, and then you start to get your life back. Is that
Yeah, and what kind of grace is that, right? And
right?
so here we are dumping 4 billion pounds of a toxin into our soils that's killing life on Earth, and Mother Earth would have the foresight to plant in her soil 60 million years ago an antidote to that toxicity. So it's too poetic and too graceful for words, and it's humbling, and it seems impossible. It just seems so unlikely that this would be a solution for anything, let alone that which we're inflicting on her soils today. So I'm amazed, I'm humbled by it. I feel overwhelmed with the possibility that maybe life on Earth is extremely intended, and we are supposed to stay despite our current behavior. And even though we're tracking towards extinction in the next 70 to 100 years, I think there's another poetic chess game happening. And just like Frodo at the gates of Mordor or something here, it looks completely hopeless. And we've got all these black, darkness of
Mhm.
empire and special interests and multi-billion-dollar chemical companies, and it just seems hopeless. And then suddenly the whole paradigm shifts, and the foes collapse and disappear in and of themselves because we don't have to fight them. And that's been my joy. Is I've never felt like some sort of activist out there preaching against Roundup and Monsanto. I'm instead screaming, oh my gosh, we don't even have to go that way. We can actually do something called regenerative farming, and we can actually do something called real nutrition, and we can actually get out of our cars and homes and cubicles and set down our phones and freaking go for a bike ride. We can actually go run on a beach. Let's change our relationship to that mother that's got a different plan for us. And let's step into the potential that she's calling us to, which is let's be a high vibration light being on this beautiful planet, and we have that potential.